Hi everyone, welcome back. This week we're discussing Perry's theory of intellectual and ethical development. Last week we discussed Chickering, which was more of an inventory of the ways in which students might and should develop during the college years. As noted, Chickering is what I would call theory light. This week we're on Perry, which is like theory classic. So at pretty much the same time that Chickering was doing his thing, Perry was directing Harvard's Bureau of Study Council. Now, what is the Bureau of Study Council, I hear you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. The BSC was founded way back in 1947, and the idea was that learning is not just an informative but a transformative experience, and students would be benefited if we could gather up some various resources on campus to provide that support. I love their list of things that they try to support, including students' academic skills, their ability to identify interests and motivations, to work and play well with others, to tolerate discomfort and uncertainty, deal with success and failure, make values-based choices, discover meaning and purpose. Oh man, good stuff, and way ahead of its time, by the way. So Perry was looking to basically do what Chickering did, to simply describe students' experiences in the classroom and how they engaged the teaching that they were experiencing. So he interviewed both men and women at the end of the year for 4 years of the students' college experience. This is what we call a longitudinal study, one that collects data from the same students over a range of time. But it seems that in terms of using the theory, he only used the data from the men, so there's that. So Perry decided that what he learned about were not just the descriptive experiences of students, but the ways in which student meaning making developed during college. And now, a quick word about meaning making. Meaning making literally refers to the ways in which an individual makes meaning of their experiences and of information that they receive. Essentially, how do we know what we know? Why do we think what we think? Let's think about it this way. You come across a political Facebook post. What do you think about it? What aspects of the post matter to you? Is it who posted it? Is it what they said? Is it how they said it? What is the meaning that you assign to the post? And why do you assign that meaning? Understanding the answers to these questions is understanding the meaning-making process. You might also hear the terms cognitive development, which is how we think, and epistemological development, which is how we know truth. So, Perry decided that what he had learned were the forms of intellectual development that shape students' meaning making. He described this as a journey, as an unfolding of views. Ooh, I like that. In keeping with student development theorists' penchant for trying to outname each other, this is sometimes referred to as Perry's scheme. So the scheme consists of 9 positions. Perry used the term positions because, 1, there's no assumption made about how long a person will persist in a position. A stage or a phase clearly sounds like something temporary, but Perry noted that it would be possible to just live in one position for your whole life or to quickly move through it. Many of us can probably think of some older individuals who still live in the early positions here. Second, the position is a description of the central tendency, meaning that it may not perfectly describe all of the individual's intellectual processes, but that it should accurately describe their most frequently used processes. And last, I think he just thought it was a good pun. Get it? A theory about how we see the world, or a position, right? Nerd humor. The other thing to know is that development doesn't occur within the position, but between positions. This seems pretty basic, but think about it. If we're interested in development, then why are we just looking at the positions? The position is necessarily static. They are resting points on the developmental journey. There are 9 positions, but don't worry, you don't have to remember all of them. We're going to focus on abridged Perry, in which the positions are grouped into concepts. We call these concepts in the book, but we also just call these positions usually in the field. So if you hear somebody say which position, what they mean is which position set or which concept. These concepts are dualism, multiplicity, relativism, and commitment to relativism. The general progress that is made is movement from a place of absolute right and wrong to a view that knowledge is uncertain and value-based. Remember, development generally in this class is going to track from simple to complex. Dualism is the most simplest way of making sense of things. Commitment to relativism is the most complicated. Dualism. Yes, dualism is, we love this in student affairs. We get very snobby about this one. To call someone dualistic is to throw a major student affairs shade. Now, the book talks about dualism as seeing the world in sort of good, bad, right, wrong, a dichotomy, so to speak. But I'm not so sure I love this definition. Consider it this way. To label an answer wrong, you must have considered that answer first. I would prefer to call this monism, but not my theory. In dualism, the individual sees things as either the truth or something else entirely. For instance, let's say an individual's parents tell them that man-made climate change is not a thing or is a thing, okay? Now, if, like most young people, they believe their parents to be wise and intelligent, then probably they're going to just accept that whatever their parents said is true, that it either is or isn't a thing, so to speak. So when someone else, maybe a classmate or a news anchor or Al Gore, says that climate change is or isn't a thing and that's different than what their parents said, it's not that their classmate or that Al Gore is wrong, it's that they're something else entirely. It's that they're deceived. It's that they're tricked. It's not that climate change may or may not be a thing. It's that it definitely is or isn't, and everybody else has been fooled. That to say that it is or isn't is fraudulent and not even a legitimate perspective to have. In dualism, we don't think about things that way. We think that there's truth, and then there's people who have been confused or fooled. This is the kind of thinking that inspired Stephen Colbert's truthiness. Stephen Colbert's alter ego that hosted the Colbert Report on Comedy Central preferred truthiness, which is, as he said, truth that comes from the gut, not books, or the ability to prefer concepts or facts one wishes to be true. So this is classic dualism. All right, but what happens if your parents disagree? Or if your parents disagree with your pastor? Or if something that a beloved coach has told you all along about how life works is proven to be not correct in your personal experience? Well, then we have cognitive dissonance, which is a changing of the rules, so to speak, that propels a student towards the next set of positions that comprise the concept of multiplicity. In multiplicity, the individual realizes that other viewpoints may be legitimate. It's not that they agree with them, it's just that they have to acknowledge that those viewpoints exist and exist as basically other versions of their own viewpoint, not as necessarily fraudulent or illegitimate as in dualism. In this position, the individual may begin to think about various viewpoints the same way we think about opinions, that we're all entitled to having our own truth. You see this a lot on pretty much any news article or social media comment thread. I challenge you tonight to go look at a comment thread about some sort of controversial post, and there will be a lot of people commenting something along the lines of, well, believe what you want to believe. This is a classic example of multiplicity. Now, in this position, students begin to think more independently, which is, I think, in some ways a good thing. But try to think about examples of the things that you've heard students say maybe, or that you've heard your peers say that illustrate this concept. And also reflect on why, in some ways, multiplicity is problematic for the kind of learning and development that we're hoping to achieve in college. Now, eventually, multiplicity becomes problematic. How can we make decisions and have any sort of confidence in a world where all perspectives might be legitimate? and we just have to pick one. That's not very comfortable after a while. So the individual begins to look for evidence and support to determine which of the perspectives to value. In relativism, knowledge or truth has become, well, relative. The individual seeks not to discover or determine the truth, but to assign value to the various perspectives. It's not that any opinion is valid, it's that all opinions their validity needs to be assessed, essentially. Relativistic thinkers are more comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily think something different from what a dualistic thinking person thinks. It's just that they arrive at their conclusions in different manners. Example, last year I was having dinner with my family, and one of my daughter's friends was with us. And it happened to be around the time of the Democratic National Convention, and I started to talk about the historic significance of Hillary Clinton receiving their party's nomination. I wasn't going to talk about this from a political perspective, because I happen to know that the students, this other kid's family has views pretty different than my own, so I definitely wasn't going to get political. But before I could even talk about it at all, my daughter's friend, who's 7 years old, by the way, gasped, "Oh, Hillary Clinton, she's a liar." Now, I feel somewhat confident that this tiny person's viewpoint represents dualistic thinking. A trusted authority said that Hillary Clinton is a liar, and so it must be true. And any other viewpoints, such as "no, she's not," would be seen as fraudulent or illegitimate things to believe. However, let's take our server, who certainly was 18 and has probably had some degree of education. Our server might have been walking by the table and heard me talking about Hillary Clinton and may have said to himself, "Oh, she's a liar." The very same perspective. But the server may be speaking after having spent hours reading news articles from reliable sources, discussing her concerns with friends of mixed political affiliations, and thoughtfully reflecting on the nature of security, transparency, leadership, and email storage. The server does not have to say, "Well, I think it's possible to likely that Hillary is a liar," to demonstrate relativistic thinking. It's just that he must have arrived at that conclusion. He must have assigned a high level of value to that perspective after critically considering the context of the perspective. Okay, so we've begun our college years accepting the wisdom of trusted authorities as capital T truth. Now, these people may have been authorities, or we may have just assigned them authority status. But we experienced some cognitive dissonance that made us begin to see truth much in the way we see opinion, that there are multiples and who knows which one's right. But after a while, that's problematic. So we started to try to assign value to those perspectives that were backed up by evidence and to consider the various information and ideas. Yes. The next position is commitment to relativism, which essentially sort of leaves the cognitive world, which is the thinking world, and enters into the physical world of action, which is the behavior world. This is where Perry gets away with adding ethical to the title of his scheme. An ethic is a mode of operating, right? So basically one commits to relativism by acting in ways that honor context and that are informed by relativistic thinking. So for instance, someone who likes to ask a lot of questions about whether or not something is the case may be demonstrating commitment to relativism because they behave in a way that recognizes I shouldn't just accept some statement as truth. Another good example is a buddy of mine is always posting fact check articles on social media on other people's posts. So it's just sort of a matter of habit for him that when he sees someone share something, the first things he does is a little bit of research to see, if other people support or disagree or have made critiques of that perspective. That might be a good example of commitment to relativism. All right, so we have two more things to discuss. The first is deflections. Perry described 3 deflections that disrupt developmental progress. The first is temporizing, wherein the individual just sort of hangs out in a position. I don't really know what causes someone to temporize, and I don't think Perry really describes it. But in my mind, these are the people who just don't develop for whatever reason, right? This is, my grandmother, for instance, who just believes that there's a certain way of everything, and anything that deviates from that way is just ridiculous and offensive to her. She just has not developed in these other ways of thinking over the years, and so maybe she's been temporizing all this time. I don't know. The second is to escape. Escape is where the individual is having trouble acting on new ways of thinking, and instead just sort of opts out. They get a taste of multiplicity, for instance, but it's just too uncomfortable, and so they sit tight in dualism. I do see this from students from time to time who I know can think in complex and contextual ways, but they don't want to accept the challenge and discomfort and risk that thinking in that way requires. They'd much rather just sort of go with the flow, for instance. The third is retreat. This happens when someone who normally would be in multiplicity or normally would be in relativism comes up against some sort of decision that is overwhelming, and then the student just reverts back to dualism. We see this a lot, actually, and not only in students. Many professionals are relativistic thinkers until maybe there's a really tough choice that comes up, or until there's a crisis situation, or until they're worried that the higher ups are gonna have an opinion about what they're doing, and then all of a sudden they just want to do whatever their boss tells them to do. Thinking about the ways the students with whom you work might do these three things, might deflect in these ways, and we'll talk about that a little bit in class. All right, so finally, the developmental instructional model. Now, Perry didn't do this. These were our friends Neffelkamp and Wittick. They said that development can be promoted in Perry by sliding the dial, so to speak, on 4 different variables of the college experience. Those variables are structure, diversity, experiential learning, and personalism. This is super helpful to me. It looks like we're at the end, and it'd be easy to sort of click through this, but I encourage you to, if you need to hit pause for a second, do some stretching or something, because this is really dense stuff and it's really important to get. So make sure you stay with us here for the developmental instructional model. All right, so structure describes the clarity and specificity of the direction given to students. High structure, which is best for students in the earlier positions, can take the form of very detailed checklists, rigid processes, and clearly defined roles and duties. Whereas students moving towards the relative positions may feel comfortable with ambiguous tasks, flexible processes, and opportunities to try new things or make their own changes. I like to think about student organization officers here. Student organization officers who just want to be told what to do are going to be benefited from a lot of structure. They're going to be benefited by very clear checklists and definitions. That's not to say that we should just tell them what to do. It's that we should frame the opportunity to realize there's more than one way to go about their role in highly structured ways. Whereas a student that's in multiplicity already maybe needs us to just not give them an answer at all, right? When they come and say, what should I do? We should just say, that sounds tough, and walk away, for instance. Those of you who work in my office may have seen or heard me do this already. All right, diversity here doesn't have anything to do with any identities or demographics. It has to do with perspectives and options and ideas, like a diversity of different perspectives and ideas. So this is best thought about in sort of a graph. The x-axis is quantity, meaning the number of different viewpoints, and the y-axis tracks quality, which is the complexity and level of support, evidence related to a perspective. If we divide the graph into quadrants, we have areas that foster growth toward the various positions, or in the case of the lower left, that don't, right? Dualism to multiplicity requires multiple perspectives, but not necessarily good ones, whereas multiplicity to relativism requires that the individual focus more on the quality of the perspective rather than engage with many perspectives. All right, so an example here might be for, let's say, the president of the campus activity board. Let's say you are the advisor for this group, and you try to suggest that the organization host different types of programs rather than the same basic programs every time. The student may say, nope, that's what we do. We have comedians, we show movies, that's it. That's what we do. That's what the president before did. That's what we've always done. That's what we're doing. Well, that sounds kind of like dualism, right? So you might create an opportunity for them to develop to multiplicity by engaging them with a high quantity of different ideas. Again, you don't need to focus on the quality of those ideas, just the quantity. And so you could have them look at the schedules of campus activity boards from other institutions. You could, have them work up a list just for the sake of it of all the different types of programs that CAB might do, or maybe even if you're real tricky, that CAB doesn't want to do. And in that way, they'll at least be exposed to a high quantity of different ideas, which may help them to realize, it's possible that more than one or two of these ideas actually is something we might want to think about doing, right? Now, a student may very well say, nope, we do comedians and movies. I know there are some other schools that do a bunch. I know you may have other ideas, but look, we could do lots, or we could only do these things. We're just going to do these things. I'm out. I'm done. Well, that's sort of a multiplicity type response, right? So for that student, more ideas aren't going to help. He's already expressed potentially that he knows that there are a lot of options out there, that there's a lot of diversity of opportunities. So what he needs is not necessarily more quantity, but higher quality, which might look like needs assessments showing that there are a lot of students out there that would love to see a magician, or that there's some assessment that shows that the types of events students like most are the events that are more intimate and have smaller audiences than the kind of events they normally have. That'd be the example of a higher quality of an opinion or quality of an option in which to engage that student. All right, experiential learning describes the degree to which the perspective is made practical and relevant as opposed to abstract. Learning through experience is important for those in the early stages who may prefer to simply be told the answer. Interestingly, those at the higher levels can engage abstract concepts more readily without compromising their relativistic thinking. For instance, many students are powerfully impacted by community service experiences. And this is because for a lot of students in dualism, which unfortunately is probably a pretty big chunk of the population, any student in dualism is not likely to change their minds about the nature of poverty or the nature of oppression, right, or privilege in just a classroom conversation. If we just deal with that topic in an abstract manner, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to abandon what they see as the capital T truth of equality and equal opportunity and freedom and whatnot. But an actual experience in which a student speaks with someone who's had hardship, or speaks with someone whose children don't have, access to education or books because of the bad choices of the parent, that's a much more experiential learning environment, and it may cause the student to realize, maybe there's more than one way of thinking about this. Likewise, a student who knows there's lots of ways of thinking about it, but is having a hard time judging between those different perspectives would probably be better off with more of a careful but abstract conversation and engagement with the topic, right? All right. The last variable is personalism. Personalism refers to the level of support and safety one feels in a given educational environment. Think about a class or work setting in which you feel comfortable and safe and supported by the teacher or supervisor. Now think of a time when the teacher or supervisor or coach or whoever was detached and critical. It's not that you can't learn from these types of teachers, it's that you aren't likely to develop from the early positions with these types of teachers. All right, so that's Perry. You need to know the 4 position concepts, the 4 developmental instructional model variables, and the 3 deflections. Or should you? What do I know? Decide for yourself what to learn. Gosh, see you in class.